would you identify as, I know you touched on a number of things like mathematicians' activity in corporations or polling or informatics or even, like you said, entertainment. So, and it's hard to be to identify this, but what would you identify as maybe the most troubling or important area to you, or maybe just an area that you have a special connection with?
Yeah, good question. I think right now, just because the election season is happening right now, that polling is something that's pretty important, but there's a whole book by a guy at, I think, Yale or Harvard, and he talks about how most polls are not, they don't interview enough people, and they also don't fulfill a lot of the other standards for polling. And so that's something that, even though there is somewhat of a code of ethics for polling organizations and professional pollers, a lot of the polls aren't done well, and there's not a, I guess, governing body to make sure those polls are being done well. And I mean, I've seen a lot of polls online that are from BuzzFeed, and like CNN is showing BuzzFeed polls as saying, this many Americans think blah, 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 and it's from BuzzFeed. And so, like, obviously, I think that's pretty important.
This will have a follow-up depending on your answer. To your knowledge, how accurate is political polling for national elections specifically?
I only skimmed the book, and because it was kind of peripheral to the project, but based on just the introduction, it doesn't seem like they're super accurate.
Okay, but so maybe not in specific percentages, but do you think they correctly predict elections on a regular basis?
I don't know. I don't know if it's so much the predictive nature of elections, but more so like other related.
Yeah,
I don't know.
You didn't give the right answer
really
for the
do
follow-up,
much.
so there's no follow-up.
James.
Kind of going off of Travis's original question, what would you say would be the biggest issue, biggest ethical issue in amongst mathematicians, not only in terms of impact and importance, but also just in terms of sheer ubiquity?
I'm not really sure. I think something that a lot of mathematicians probably think most about in terms of the talks that I went to the meetings, or that were at the meetings, fairness seemed to be the most important value that people were wanting math to promote. And so a lot of decision making that would be the most fair for a bunch of groups of people. I think that seemed to be the most important issue that was on the table, at least at the meetings, the regional meetings.
So let's say the president of the MAA called you up and said, we heard that you've been working on this brilliant project, and now we want to commission you to write the official code of conduct, ethical code of conduct now that the MAA is going to adopt, and we expect all of our members to adhere to one degree or another. What would you most want to see in that kind of code?
I think I'd like to see a code that takes into account a lot of perspectives. So I think I'd really want a good team that was thoughtful and took into account a lot of different situations and people's faith backgrounds, that allowed for people to suggest certain values that say their faith's really valued, and see what overlaps there were, and to have those represented, but also allow for flexibility depending on your belief system or worldview. Yeah.
So kind of going off of that, would you say in this new code that perhaps even if the math suggests something, that might not be the right decision whenever you take humanity into account? Like you said, the 10% could suffer, but since they are human and they are people that need to be taken care of, that the math might be there, but it's still the wrong decision.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's absolutely the case because this is kind of an extreme example, but the math says we can't support our population. So, I mean, we should just get rid of the population that we can't support. And so, I mean, that would just be like a simple algorithm, but I don't think that would, I hope that wouldn't happen. But that would just be like an extreme example in which, you know, you obviously don't like kill a bunch of people just because you can't keep it.
So you have, in philosophy and epistemology specifically, there's a lot of talk about intellectual virtues like wisdom, humility, openness. I think not only in intradisciplinary conversations, but also interdisciplinary conversations and dialogue. To what degree should a code of ethics in mathematics embody those sorts of intellectual virtues, especially where it comes to interdisciplinary dialogues?
I would say it should address and support them. I think the intellectual virtues are pretty important, but obviously it kind of goes back to, you know, the team and the organization itself, because I think depending on the organization, it might affect whether or not you want to refer or promote those intellectual virtues. But say you're at a university, I think it might be more appropriate to the conversation than perhaps if you're in a professional mathematic corporation organization. That makes sense. Dr. Anderson.
This is kind of a thought experiment question.
Okay.
So, assume for the sake of argument that the MAA proved unwilling eventually to adopt a more robust ethical code. Do you think that Christian mathematicians should take it upon themselves in that kind of a scenario to develop a more robust system of ethics that they're going to hold themselves to, even if the broader organization is not going to?
Yeah, I think so. There actually is an organization for Christian mathematicians, and I looked and they didn't have a code of ethics. So
Okay.
I think that would be a great place to start.
Okay. They might be more receptive to your suggestion, at least in the
Yeah.
immediate term.
I did
Yeah.
meet someone who's going to the North Carolina meeting they're having, I think next year. So I might talk to him a little bit more.
What was the most difficult part of this process, either in the synthesis and presenting it, or was there, you know, a time when the research maybe slowed and you didn't know where to head or what direction you were going?
Yeah, I think the hardest part was settling down into something specific enough for this project, because I had a lot of other interests and also a more extensive idea for this project, but I needed to narrow it down so that it would be more realistic to get done. So I think just narrowing down my interest into something that was a topic that I could write a paper on was the hardest part, because there are a lot of interesting intersects between anthropology and mathematics, and then also just even within mathematics or anthropology. Yes.
So, representing different faiths specifically is really kind of part of your heartbeat of what you're looking at with building a code of ethics. Is there maybe an example you could think of where a group of mathematicians working around a certain project or task might come to conflict based on their different ethical and religious backgrounds that, like a standard code of ethics might help clarify?
Yeah, absolutely. This is kind of a side note, but it's related. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was actually something that had a lot of, I guess you could say, God talk and faith talk, but then the final form appears without faith or without relation to God. But the conversations all had to do with it. They just, at the end, they basically just took out any reference to God or faith or anything related to that, just so it could be applied across the board. But people still, people can still look at that as an example of something that, is, I guess, worthwhile to look at, even if their faith is different. And it's something that kind of unifies people towards different ends. So I think, yeah, it could definitely help.
So I think one of the, speaking as a mathematician, I think one of the dilemmas that I see when I think about developing a code of ethics is that a lot of times when we do mathematics, we have no idea what's going to become of it. Right? Like whoever invented vectors in the 19th century had no idea it was going to be used to make Pixar movies, right? I mean, like, no clue. And I think that is a real dilemma when we publish things, we don't know what it could be used for. It could be used for good, it could be used for bad, we have no idea. How do you think a code of ethics should address things like that? Or have you thought about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the code of ethics would address the application of that. So just because somebody invented vectors and they didn't know what was going to happen doesn't mean that later on people who do use that just kind of have free reign because that person did it so long ago that it's like, well, that person might not be who the code of ethics is for, but people who use that kind of research. So I think that a lot of research too is funded for certain ends, and so I think being aware of those ends would also be helpful, and something that's worth putting into a code of ethics is, like, find out who you're working for and why you're working for that person, because even what seems to be, say, pure mathematics or pure research definitely has a certain end. And so, I mean, say artificial intelligence, for instance, or drone research, stuff like that.
I've left the silence to the awkward point. And so that will be a good place then to wrap up. If you did have questions that you didn't ask, whether you were too shy or just couldn't find your voice, Matt will hang around, I'm sure, to answer questions if you want to come up and ask him individually. But this will wrap up the thesis presentation time. Matt, job very well done. Please join me in congratulating Matt.